Hello friends, welcome. Friends, today's video is going to be pretty interesting. It is not going to be a technical video. This video is about the telecom industry of India. What kind of events took place starting from year 2001 with the culmination of 2G scam and the impact of 2G scam on the overall competitive dynamics of the telecom industry. And today we are seeing that the telecom industry has become a monopoly with the third operator, Vodafone Idea, almost going out of business. So this story is a very long and complex story. Nobody has told this story in an integrated fashion, which I am going to describe to you today. And the reason that I am telling the story today is that the memories became fresh in my mind because of Mr. Anil Ambani summoned by ED for a 17,000 crore loan fraud investigation, and he got entangled into a controversy in year 2008, though his company got bailed out, though it was also allocated spectrum at the same time when the other licensees got allocated spectrum in 2008, which were the same set of company where licenses were given by Raja at a subsidized rate. So friends, just be with me, and it is going to be a very, very interesting video. A lot of things has to be covered, and I am going to do it in one single shot without editing this video, so it's a challenge. So please be with me. So friends, what I have done, I actually have created a slide deck, as I always do, to anchor my thoughts so that I don't digress. See, the title of this slide deck is Anatomy of 2G Scam, but it is not just about 2G scam. It is about the events which led to the 2G scam and what impact that 2G scam caused to the health of the industry, so that we are in this state of affair where the industry has become a monopoly with Vodafone Idea going out of business. So that's the story we are going to describe to you today. Now, friends, before I get to the series of events, I have put together certain questions which we will answer step by step, because these questions are very, very important. You can pause the video and look at these questions. I'm going to read this question before you. Why were auctions abandoned after 2003 in favor of first come, first serve allocation of spectrum or licenses, right? How did Reliance entry via WLL is wireless in local loop, set a precedent? What changed in year 2008 to trigger mass license application? Because earlier also first come first serve policy was in place, but the number of licenses were not, the applicants were limited. Why? There were so many applicants which came up in 2008, right? What happened, right? Why did they apply? Why were the dual tech licenses spared in 2012 SC verdict, right? Because they were also almost in the similarly placed. How did TRAI's 2007 recommendation distort the policy? TRAI actually recommended that the 800, 900 and 1800 megahertz spectrum should not be auctioned, though it was scarce, right? And they recommended 3G spectrum auction. So how did it lay the foundation of the 2G scam? How did 3G auction prices created a valuation paradox? Because the auctions were held after 2008 in 2010, just after those licenses were given in a subsidized rate, leading to a high valuation of spectrum price. What damage did post-2012 auction fear cause to the sector, right? Now, friends, I am not going to read through the bullets because this story is just fresh in my mind because I've gone through the whole process. I'm going to start from the beginning. Now, in earlier, right, just before the 2003 WLL controversy, licenses were auctioned. The last auction took place in year 2001, the 4 cellular license. So the licenses were bundled with spectrum with a minimum quantum, which is GSM spectrum in 900 megahertz spectrum band. Now the 4th license was given spectrum in 1800 megahertz spectrum band, 4.4 megahertz, 2 into 4.4 megahertz, right? Now after the spectrum was given or the licenses were given in 2001, in parallel, basic services were also given licenses. And the basic services licenses were limited to providing basic services, which were almost similar to the old BSNL fixed line telephone, right? The mobile services where the licenses were given, which were being running under the GSM technology, where full mobility was offered. So the basic services licenses were valued at a lower price compared to the cellular licenses. So quite natural, because you have got limited capability. So what happened was, when the basic services licenses were given, there were a lot of hue and cry regarding the ability of the basic services licensees to roll out network in a quick way, because laying wireline network is quite time consuming. It requires a lot of right of way, etc. So they were allowed last mile wireless access to deploy their telephones. So the last mile was wireless, rest of the things were wireline, and they were not permitted to do full mobility, right? Now, they were given spectrum in a band which is 800 megahertz, which were for CDMA technology. So they were allowed to do CDMA technology to do the last mile, right? And full mobility was not allowed. Now, because both CDMA and GSM were similarly placed and full capability to do full mobility, the basic services licenses were able to use technology to circumvent this regulation, which prevented them to do full mobility. And therefore, their licenses became at par with the GSM license. So the GSM license complained, saying that, look, you paid lower license fee. Now you're doing full mobility, right? And I paid full licenses at the full rate for full mobility. So how can you do full mobility by paying a subsidized rate? Matter went to Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, what Supreme Court did was they enforced a penalty on Reliance, who actually were running WLL license, of 485 crores, and asked them to pay the difference between the cellular license, the auction which took place in year 2001, and the basic services license fee. So they pay a difference of rupees 1096 crores. So after that, they were regularized. So now they became similar to what the GSM operators were offering, full mobility services, right? Now, because the basic services were given the ability to offer full mobility services through an intervention of Supreme Court, and with the imposition of differential license fee as well as a penalty, then the auctions which were happening before that for allocation of licenses with a bundle spectrum of 4.4 megahertz were dismantled. The policy got dismantled in favor of first come, first serve. This was the foundation of first come, first serve. Earlier, the policy of allocation of licenses were through an auction model. Now, this model continued for a long period of time, but there were no problems, right? Because when auctions were abundant because of the first come first serve became institutionalized, which because of the WLL operator being converted into full mobility, there were no problem, because the number of licenses applicants who were seeking spectrum to the first come first serve policy were quite low. Now, this is a very, very nuanced kind of fact which people have to understand, that why the number of players who were applying for licenses before 2007 were low when the first come first serve policy was right on the table, right? DOT, though it was not clearly documented that what steps have to be followed, but DOT, everybody knew that they can apply for license, and the DOT, since they have already given Reliance license based on the 2001 auction rate, right? Because they paid the difference. Similarly, the other license could have been given. So it's kind of an informal policy which DOT were following without a written clear-cut guidelines. There were no written guidelines, but the number of applicants were low. Why the number of applicants were low? Because the spectrum was for GSM was limited. Now, which band the spectrum was allocated for GSM? This was the 1800 megahertz spectrum band, because the 900 megahertz band was completely filled. The first band was 900. This was the band which looks like this now. The 1800 megahertz was the higher spectrum band, which was occupied by defense. So this color you see, this is defense. So defense actually occupied from here to here. All the spectrum, most of the spectrum was occupied by defense. So there was not spectrum available, right, to be given. Since there was no spectrum available, people who knew, they were the informant of the industry. They knew that how the spectrum availability is there, there was no point in making an application when the DOT didn't have spectrum. Now, why defense was occupying such a large quantum of 1800 megahertz spectrum? Because of legacy reason. The equipment that they were using, the defense equipment, was actually in this band. So even before the telecom licenses were given, a set of telecom licenses were given, the ministry actually were aware of the fact that they can't ramp up the mobile networks in India without having more spectrum in 1800 megahertz spectrum band. So they requested defense to vacate this band. Now, defense said that they can't vacate this band. Why? Because they have to move to an alternate network, which is optical fiber network. Now, the DOT was tasked with the work of providing an optical fiber network. So, defense said that as soon as you give me the optical fiber network, I am going to make this spectrum available for mobile services, right? So, this was the reason why, and DOT was very slow. They did not make up the optical fiber network in time. So, the spectrum was being blocked by defense. They were not released, and that's why if you look at here, the FCS was stable, and since the number of applicants were low, they were not applying because the spectrum was not there. Even if you make an application, you are not going to get spectrum because the spectrum was being blocked. Now, there is another thing which is in this whole story we need to understand, right? And what is this story about? And because this story is pretty important to understand, because this triggered the dual technology licensees to seek GSM spectrum. Right. Now, what happened was that when the WLL controversy was going on, the CDMA guys made an affidavit in the court saying that CDMA is 5 times more efficient. If you are going to cancel my WLL license, it is not going to be national interest. Right. So court took that as an affidavit. Now, when the WLL licenses were regularized, because the spectrum was not auctioned, it was a portion of it was bundled with the license, right? When the licenses were granted based on auction, which is 2001, and later on first come first serve, whenever you got a license, you have to pay an entry fee equal to the price of the 2001 auction, plus a small amount of spectrum was given, 4.4 megahertz for GSM and 2.5 megahertz for CDMA, 2 into 2.5 megahertz for CDMA for you to launch services. But more spectrum was given based on a subscriber-based criteria because spectrum was not available in sufficient quantity because of the reason which I told you that defense was sitting on all the spectrum. So they came out with the subscriber-based criteria, and the subscriber-based criteria was made in a manner that those operators who were rolling out more subscribers will need more spectrum, therefore they will be given more spectrum. So the GSM had a different criteria and the CDMA has a different criteria. Now, since GSM was more inefficient, they got more spectrum on less subscriber. CDMA, which was an efficient spectrum, got less spectrum for more subscriber because they were efficient. Even though the 800 megahertz band, which was used for CDMA, was lying back end, GSM really had a spectrum constraint. Now, because of this reason, the CDMA players were not able to utilize eVideo, which was a data technology, because you were not given spectrum, and the spectrum that the criteria was tuned towards voice, and CDM was a data technology. So they could not deploy eVideo to monetize their network properly. Therefore, the CDMA operators got frustrated and they wanted GSM spectrum. Now you got it. Why the dual technology reason? Why the operators went to GSM? Because the spectrum policy became a trigger, right? Now, the GSM scarcity worsened by DOT's defense delay, which we have already disclosed. The 1800 megahertz spectrum was held by defense, pending OFC swap. DOT promised the swap, but delayed execution and GSM GSM operators stalled due to artificial spectrum availability. Now, TRAI's 2007 recommendation trigger was a major trigger. Now, what happened was that all these things were going on. The CDMA guys got constrained, they got frustrated, they wanted to move to GSM technology to get a better spectrum treatment because they were giving twice the quantum of spectrum. So in the meantime, Reliance applied for GSM spectrum. At that time, there was no policy. I think they did it in 2006. There was no policy, right, for giving more spectrum, and especially to a player who already is running a mobile operation. right? So at the time, there was a debate, right, in TRAI that whether new operators should be permitted or not, because they were already existing operator and spectrum was a scarce resources for these existing operators also, because the subscriber based criteria was such that even when the operators were having more subscribers, because of this constraint that defense was holding a lot of spectrum here, they could not get spectrum. So they were eligible, but they were not giving spectrum, right? So TRI came out with a recommendation saying that new operators should be permitted. Now, how can TRI permit new operators when there were no spectrum, right? The spectrum was occupied by defense and they were the existing operator already, eligible for more spectrum based on subscribers criteria, but not given spectrum. So their claim has to be somehow mitigated, the existing operators. Then you have to release spectrum from defense to make the new operator enter the market. So there were two challenges. First, you have to remove the claim of their existing operator and then free the spectrum from defense. Because if you had allowed the claim of the existing operator, then this whole spectrum would have got used by the existing operator, because the subscribers criteria was such that if they were given spectrum based on the subscriber they had, the whole spectrum would have got used. Right. So what TRI did, TRI now came out with a subscriber-based criteria, which is more stringent than what it was earlier, 5 times more stringent. So the claims of the existing operator on this spectrum immediately got evaporated. They had no claim because their subscriber numbers were not even sufficient to meet the TRA's revised guidelines. So that problem was solved. Now, this problem was not solved because defense was still sitting on this spectrum because OFC network was not given, right? So how did this problem got solved? So let's talk about this, right? So Raja's exploitation of policy gap. Now, what happened was, at that time, there was a coalition government. So you had this UPA government on one side, and then there was a coalition partner on the other side, right? Now, defense, they knew that they have to vacate this spectrum. So they already vacated. They were just holding this spectrum in order to expedite their OFC network. So this spectrum was actually lying vacant. It was not used. So Raja knew that. So what Raja did was he forcefully extracted that spectrum from defense. Right? So these are not documented, friends, but I'm telling you the inside story, what actually happened, right? So that spectrum got immediately available. So those players who were not an applicant, because this spectrum was not available, two things happened. One is the TRI recommendation nullified the demand of the existing operator on this spectrum, and this block of spectrum which defense was sitting got released. So now the operators who were just not applying for the spectrum because there were nothing there, no licenses got up. They suddenly saw there was a floodgate of spectrum got opened. So there was a huge number of applications which came on, in the pipeline. Now you understand that why there was a huge number of applications which immediately got triggered, and there was nothing which was happening, even when the first come first serve policy was not the policy of the government at that time, which were accused of causing the 2G scam, right? Now, dual technology license escaped the cancellation. Why? Because as I told you, the Reliance actually applied, the RCOM applied for dual technology much in advance in 2006, even before the policy of giving licenses was announced by Mr. Raja in 2007, and in 2008, they were given spectrum. And dual technology operators were also given spectrum along with the other operators, right? So this whole policy got clouded, and the dual tech operator, especially Reliance, got scot-free because it was not challenged under those licenses which were given by Mr. Raja in the policy after the policy was announced, right? Then what happened was 3G auction happened in 2010. Now, this set of operators who got the spectrum based on the 2001 entry fee, and they were given bundle spectrum of 4.4 megahertz, right? So they got it in a subsidized rate. They got, loan from the bank. Now, once you get a 2G license, in order to monetize your network, you needed 3G. You could not have done without, you could not simply run a 2G operation. So So there were 14 players in the market holding 2G license. At that moment, you have the 3G auction with just 3 slots. 14 players chasing 3 slots. So what would happen? There will be a demand supply mismatch. So the 3G auction went completely overboard, and it fetched 67,719 crores. One slot of 5 megahertz resulted in a price of 16,700 crores. Now, suddenly, right, before 3G auction, everybody was sitting quiet. Nobody was raising. Now, suddenly, when the auction happened and the price of 5 megahertz spectrum was 16,700 crores, CAG woke up, and the CAG put a notional loss of 7.5 lakh crores on spectrum which was given in 2008 and before. Now you can see that this is a circular logic, because the 3G auction price could not have been elevated without that spectrum. Now you are valuing that spectrum based on the 3G auction price, right? Supreme Court verdict in 2012. It cancelled all the 122 license, the January 2008 batch. It considered the first come first serve policy as arbitrary, capricious, and unconstitutional. Spectrum is a natural resource, it is scarce, and therefore it must be allocated transparently. Auction not constitutionally mandatory but preferred. Now, every time when the spectrum auction, is being quoted by the incumbents, they take the garb of the Supreme Court judgment. Now, Supreme Court judgment is the most misinterpreted judgment of 2012, because every time, whenever spectrum is being granted, you say Supreme Court judgment. When satellite spectrum was supposed to be given, Supreme Court judgment. But Supreme Court actually spoke about scarcity. It says that auction should be done when the resources are scarce, and spectrum is a scarce resource. Now, spectrum may not be a scarce resource all the time. It can be abundant, right? For example, backhaul spectrum, satellite spectrum. Even today, as I told you in many of my past videos, that every time the government put out spectrum for auction, almost all of it remains unsold, a fraction of gets sold. So if it is like this, then spectrum is not a scarce commodity. Then Supreme Court judgment should not be applicable. This is the nuanced thing which people don't talk about. Now, fallout of high prices, the industry collapse. Post 2012 auction, we had high reserve prices. Operator overbid, and then they got excited, which I already spoke to you. And this became the reference point for future reserve price, because people were scared because of the CAC thing and the regime hyping it to such a level that the whole nation become hypnotized by the 1.76 lakh crores of loss. And that eroded public trust, and spectrum remained underutilized, and the industry became monopolistic, because the high price of spectrum can be only afforded by those players with deep pockets, and the rest of the players were driven out of the market. So the conclusion is very simple. 2G scam was not just a moment of corruption, alleged corruption. It was a decade of missteps. Reliance regulation, TRAI's ambiguity, Raja's manipulations, SC's intervention reset the rule, but the damage was done, and the SC judgment was misinterpreted because they spoke about scarcity. Then only, and they spoke about auction in the background of scarcity. If it is not scarce, then there could be other methods of allocation of spectrum transparently. The price of policy failure from competitive chaos to monopoly. Today, the state of the industry, which is completely getting dismantled because of Vodafone Idea going out of business, not just because of the AGR issue. Spectrum auction played a very important role, friends. And all these policy decisions, which I described in a short window of 25 or 24 minutes, resulted in the state of affair that we are today. I hope that you understood it. It was a very difficult video to zip it in a very short window of time. I've tried my level best. And I hope that you have understood it. And thanks for listening till the end. I'll come back with a new video and a new topic next time. Thank you very much, friends.